Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for the people joining us from Asia. I hope that you and your loved ones are staying safe and healthy. I'm glad you were able to join us today. It is a pleasure, as always, to have you here with us and participate in this event to listen, learn, and get a chance to ask some of our panelists some key questions about nutrition. My name is Carlos Salinas, and I'm USSEC's Senior Director for soybean meal. Before I start, I would like to thank our audience, our presenters, and the team at USSEC for helping us put together this event. I can assure you that being a moderator is the easiest part of this task. The objective of today's event is focused in better understanding the nutritional and economic value of soybean meal from different origins. I would say, more important, better understanding the components that make the difference. Animal nutrition and feeding formulations vary greatly by region depending on the ingredient alternatives and prices available in each market. There's no one-size-fits-all strategy when we talk about feeding formulations. As a reminder, if you would like to ask questions for the panel, simply type your questions in the Q&A widget located in the bottom of the console. Make sure all questions are submitted in the Q&A widget instead of the chat widget to make sure we can adequately address your questions. Additionally, the presentations are available for download in the handout widget if you choose to do so. With that in mind, I would like now to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Gonzalo Mateos. Dr. Mateos holds a BS in animal production from the Universidad Politécnica de Madrid and a PhD in vet science from the Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona and a PhD in animal science from Iowa State University. He has worked in the industry in Spain and in the US as product manager of American Cyanamid Company and as technical manager, chief nutritionist, and feed mill manager of one of the largest and biggest co-ops in Spain. Currently, he's a professor of animal science at the University of Madrid. He has published 135 papers and given more than 450 seminars at national and international congresses in more than 40 countries. He was editor-in-chief of the Scientific Journal of Animal Feed Science and Technology and a member of the editorial board of Poultry Science and Animal Feed Science and Technology. Dr. Mateos will present the results of a recent publication titled Chemical Composition, Protein Quality, and Nutritive Value of Commercial Soybean Meals Produced from Beans from Different Countries, a meta-analysis study. Dr. Mateos, with that in mind, the floor is yours. Thank you once again for joining us.
Today's presentation will be on the influence of the origin of the beans on the chemical composition and nutritive value of commercial soybean meals. This is a subject that has great interest because there is a lot of papers in the last years published indicating that the soybean meals are not the same, but that depends not only on the crushing plant, but also might depend on the origin of the beans. In order to do that, what we did is to work and to look for all the papers that were published in the last 10 years in which at least two different soybean meals were compared. In this aspect, we pick up the four main countries, Argentina, Brazil, USA, and India, and we pick up a total of around close to 200,000, as you can see. In total, we found only 18 papers published in the last in the last 20 years, from 2005 to 2019, and in these papers there were 58 comparisons among soybean meal samples. So to me, it's the biggest survey that has ever been conducted comparing the origins of the soybeans on the characteristics, the chemical analysis, and the protein quality of the soybean meal. In this case, I'm going to present only the general data, the most important, because we analyze everything. We analyze here the minerals, macro, micro, fibers, oligosaccharides, sucrose, proximal analysis, amino acids, and just protein quality indicators. And here is the main point that I want to put, and these points are the ones that are related with the protein value or the energy content of the soybean meal. And as you see, I'm going to compare Brazilian with USA, and you can see Argentina and India, how they behave. And you see, as we expected, the Brazilian used to have close to 1 point more of a protein than the USA. and the USA has to have around close to 1% more protein than the Argentina meals. Now, this is important, but it's not the only parameters that we have to look. If you see, for example, I put here only 2 amino acids, the profile, which means how good the proteins are, not only the quantity of the protein, but how good the proteins are. You see that the lysine percentage per unit of protein is much higher in the USA than in the Brazilian, and the same for the sulfur amino acids. So that means that crude protein is important, but it's not the only thing we need to know from the meals. And second, you have here the sucrose. Sucrose, nobody analyzed the sucrose of the soybean meal. First, it's very sweet, and second, has a lot of energy. Sucrose is very digestible. And you see there that the USA has almost 2 points more than Brazilian. So means that the energy should be higher for the USA from Brazilian based on the sucrose. If you have more sucrose, in this case, you have something less, and you see that the USA has less fiber and nutrient fiber and a little bit more phosphorus. And the reason is the Ecuador. You see the latitude is not only the latitude, it's just the Ecuador's means humidity, means protein, means humidity, means rainfall, means temperature, means day length, etc., etc. So depending on how far the soybeans are from the Ecuador, they will have totally different chemical composition. And here is the closer to the Ecuador in general, the closer you are to the Ecuador, the crude protein, the oil content will be higher, and the linoleic will be better, but they will have more free fatty acid and peroxides of the oil. Also, the closer to the Ecuador, you have more raffinose and crude fiber, and you have more Maillard reactions, probably because of the harvesting period. However, the closer you are to the Ecuador, you have less sucrose and stachyose, and you have poor amino acid profile. And finally, probably because you are heating more the soybeans because of the humidity, usually the soybeans from Ecuador, close to the Ecuador, as Brazilian, in the north of Brazil, they will have more TRIPS inhibitors, less TRIPS inhibitors, and lower PDI and lower KOH. So this is general. It does not depend on the country. It depends on how far you are from the Ecuador. And here, for example, you see the amino acid profile. As we mentioned, the USA has better profile for lysine, methionine, cysteine, and threonine, which is good. It has less protein, but it has more amino acid profile. So at the end, one thing will compensate the other. And here you have the protein indicators, which is important to see what is the quality of the protein that you have, the digestibility. And against, for example, Brazilian has more protein, as we said already, than the USA, but the urease activity is very similar. Urease is not a good method to check the quality of the soybean meal, but you see that you have, Brazilian will have less solubility, which means more heat has been applied. So you have lower PDI, lower KOH, you have slightly less TRIPS inhibitor activity, but remember, not low TRIPS inhibitor activity is always good. Depends on the heat damage indicator, which is the Maillard reactions. So the key point here, you want low Maillard reactions, and the TRIPS inhibitor should be behind 4 ppm, 4 milligrams per gram. So in this case, you see that the quality based on that is probably better for the USA because you have less Maillard reaction, but still okay for the TRIPS inhibitors than the Brazilians or the Argentinian. And here one thing is important, people forget. Everybody is talking about amino acid when talking about soybean meal, but energy every day is more important, especially broilers and turkey diets, for example. And sucrose, remember that the US has close to 2 points more of sucrose than the Brazilian, is very well digested by the chicken. It's 80% of ileal digestibility and 90% if you include fermentation. So the higher the sucrose, the higher the digestibility of these ingredients, the higher the energy. So just because you have more sucrose, probably the digestibility of the soybean meal should be higher, the digestibility of the energy should be higher for the soybean meal from the USA. And this is the equation, this is the problem. When we calculate for amino acids, it's easier to do that. But for the energy, most of the people will use the equation. And the most useful equation today is the WAPSA equation. Was published, but the problem is that this equation was created in 1986 and published in 1989. And its basis, as you see, crude protein, which is not correct, should be based on digestible protein, and its basis in nitrogen-free extract. And remember, nitrogen-free extract is obtained by difference. which means that the sucrose, which is very digestible, has, according to this equation, the same energy than the lignin, that all of us know that is not digestible, so the energy is zero. Now, lately, there are two new equations that I put there from the CBB from the Netherlands, in which they are taking care of other ingredients that make sense, other nutrients, as include fiber in the first thing, and the second, the one is taking care of the digestibility, which is good, and the containing starch plus sugars, which is also good. And what I did is just to apply these three equations to the soybean meal from the survey. Remember, I put there crude protein and sucrose for your information, and I applied the three equations. Based on the WAPSA, that remember, WAPSA is not taking into account digestibility, is not taking into account sugars, Brazilian and USA has the same energy. However, if we apply the second equation of the CBB, in which the sucrose and the starch, which is very similar, around 1%, and the digestibility is taken into account, then the USA has more energy than the Brazilian. So the point here is that we will need a new equation to demonstrate and to check the energy content of the soybean meal, taking into account the digestibility of the protein, not the total protein, and the sucrose content, not the nitrogen-free extract. And here, this is, again, I put this in evaluation what happened in the real life. And this is, remember, Argentina, Brazil, and USA. I took out here India to facilitate the reading, and with the values that we obtain in this meta-analysis. If I buy the soybean meal based exclusively in the protein content, of course I will buy Brazilian because they have more protein than the Argentina or the USA. However, if we take into account the profile, the lysine profile, I forget about the other amino acids that are similar, then look at what happened. The lysine in percentage of soybean meal, remember animals don't need protein, they need the amino acid, digestible amino acid. So if we look at the lysine, only total lysine, then Brazilian and USA, in spite of the Brazilian having more protein, they have similar total lysine content. Third, if we look also at the digestibility of lysine based on the paper from Ravindran or from other authors, we know that the digestibility of the protein is slightly better for the USA than the from Brazil, 1 point in this case. And then we analyze the value based on digestible lysine, then USA will be better than Brazil. Look at how the buyer preference changes depending on what you are looking for. If you look for sucrose, you will have more energy, and clearly the people based on sucrose will prefer the USA. And based on fiber, you have less for the USA, the people will prefer the USA. If you are looking at digestible phosphorus, in this case, the preference will be for USA and Argentina. So the point is that it's very, very important to check and to make sure that you are not following only one criteria, but several criteria to check for the value of the soybean meal. And that's the conclusion. At similar crude protein content, the nutritive value of soybean meal is greater for the US meal than for the South American or Indian meals. And here you can read the conclusions on the reason for what. And the main point here is that the nutritionists should use different matrices for the evaluation of the nutritional value of soybean meal of different origins. If they buy based on protein, they might make some mistakes. If they are buying only based on sucrose, they might too. So they have to check all the values that are related to the nutritive value of the soybean meal. Thank you for listening.
Dr. Mateos, thank you very much for your presentation. It is indeed very informative and unique perspective that helps us better understand why soybean meals from different origins are not the same. I already have a set of questions here from our audience that we will ask at the end of our presentations. At that point in time, we will have, I would say, plenty of time for a Q&A session. As a reminder, and if you would like to ask questions for the panel, simply type your question on the Q&A widget located in the bottom of the console. Once again, make sure you go to the Q&A widget instead of the chat widget so we can adequately address your questions. Understanding quality difference is clearly important, but what many in our audience would like to know is how to make use of this information to maximize profits. How can we translate these results and studies into economic value for our customers or for your operation? With this in mind, I would like now to introduce Mr. Matthew Clark, our second speaker. Mr. Clark, along with his partner, Peter Schott, are the co-founders of Genesis Feed Technology. Matthew graduated with a degree in farm management from the University of London in 1980. After working 3 years as an assistant farm manager in England, Matthew joined a technology group in the UK and trained as a nutritionist to work on overseas assignments, mainly in Southeast Asia. Matthew has worked extensively in the distribution of formulation systems, starting with the Brill Corporation in Atlanta as VP of Product Development. In 2009, Matthew rejoined the Brill formulation team under a new ownership of Feed Management Systems from Minneapolis, Minnesota, as Director of Southeast Asian Sales and Market Development. This position transitioned to a representation of Feed Management Systems in Asia through his company, Feed Gas Resources Pte. Matthew's formulation work continues as founder member of Genesis Feed Technology in Fargo, North Dakota, bringing practical knowledge of feed mill management and integration to the team to develop new software solutions. Genesis is creating a new generation of web-based formulation tools designed to complement existing feed formulation programs to enable a more detailed economic decision. Matthew is now joining us from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Mr. Clark, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Carlos. There we are. Good morning, everybody, and good evening to my friends and colleagues out in Southeast Asia. It's great to be able to present to you this evening, and I'd like to thank USSEC for inviting us to speak. Right. Do we have our first slide online, please? There we are. Hello. Yes, our first slide. There we go. Right, I'm going to introduce the nutrient value calculator, and this is a kind of feed formulation system that we put together in Genesis Feed Technologies. And the idea is that we want to enable buyers and generally non-technical people to look at the nutrient profile of different feed ingredients and understand very quickly, very easily, what the combination of the nutritional value and the economic value is. Now, we developed this platform actually specifically with soybean meal in mind. We found it has other applications as well, but our basic mission here is to support an important point that Dr. Mateos mentioned, is that we are transitioning our evaluation of soybean meal from the traditional protein approach over to looking at the total nutrient profile and how soybean meals will contribute to the whole of the diet. Now, when we look at soybeans, we've got basically 5 components. The oil is a major one, and when we take that oil out and we have the soybean meal, we have some moisture left, of course. We have crude protein, which is a big interest in the trade, but we need to look more in more detail at the components of the protein. And there's this very interesting area we're looking at now of the soluble starches and the soluble sugars, particularly sucrose, that is present in the soybean meal. And we are discovering more and more that this is a differentiating factor of soybean meals in practice around the world. Now, as we do this evaluation, we're going to present to you a selection of what we're doing with USSEC in bringing up the price evaluations of soybean meal in different markets around the globe. And I'm going to give you some data that relates to the Americas, that's Gulf origin mainly, Ecuador, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Morocco. Now, this list of countries, they've got a variety of different ingredient situations and prices. There are some tariffs involved in changing the market prices within the country. And so they present an interesting spectrum of situations where different regions and different countries will come up with a different economic value for comparing soybean meals. As we move around the world and we're evaluating our materials, we're evaluating them in the context of the local feeds. And I'm going to be looking at broiler and layer feeds mainly with you today, but every country we deal with has their own methodology of making a broiler feed. So Indonesia grows a small bird, they have very high protein starters. Malaysia grows a larger bird, they have higher energy and grower feeds in particular. And the balance of the nutrients they will require in the growth cycle are quite different. So we do look at individual regions and consider the feeds that they need to make. And lastly, of course, we were indebted to Dr. Mateos and his team for the updated soybean meal nutrient values that go into this study as we look at the main suppliers, which would be Argentina, Brazil, US, and India. Oh, there we go. Next one. Okay, so as we look at, it's just a table for a reference. If you look at the handout, these are the regional prices that we've used in the different areas. Looking at corn, for example, the Americas $177 per metric ton. Ecuador, because of tariffs and government controls, very much higher, 380. And this is the kind of thing that gives us a different perspective on the value of the soybean meals as we move around the world. Indonesia, too, has some restrictions on imports, or big restrictions on imports of corn, so they have a relatively high price. Nearby in Malaysia, the price of corn is much lower. It's only about $35 more expensive than the US price. Morocco, somewhat in between Indonesia and Malaysia. Soybean meal, too, is going to vary in price around the world. And if we look at the amino acids, we don't see so much variation now globally in amino acids, but these two will affect the value of the soybean meal. Now, I would like to draw your attention to the line that says fat there. And we can see that in the Americas, the price of fat is $550 per ton. Ecuador, much higher. And we look at Indonesia, a little bit cheaper than the US, Malaysia slightly more expensive. We have to bear in mind, and it will become apparent, that the fat cost is quite a big determinant of the value of soybean meal, because soybean meal, as we will see, is an energy contributor in diets. And if fat or energy in a particular region is expensive, that value of the energy in the soybean meal becomes even more apparent. Now, here's some sample formula specs. As I mentioned, in Indonesia, it's a fairly small bird they grow. It's only 1.6 kilos. So we only have two feeds there, a pre-starter feed and a starter feed. We don't need to use a grower or finisher because the bird is too small. Different regions, like in America, would have maybe 4 or 5 different diets, growing to much bigger weights. Ecuador somewhere in the middle. So our nutrient value calculator looks also at the feeding program as it varies from country to country. And here we look at a very quick review of the data that Dr. Mateos has generated for us. We can see that on the crude protein measure, we would probably pick up the Brazilian soybean meal as having the highest crude protein. But I would like to draw your attention to the line that says AME broilers. And we can see here that the US soybean meal has a clear advantage over the other 3 sources in the energy level of the soybean meal. Now, I know you will say to me, Matthew, soybean meal is a protein source. But I would say yes, but the energy is such a valuable thing in these monogastric diets that we have to take it into account. Although today I'm going to be talking mainly about poultry diets, I also point out that the ME for swine, we find that the US soybean meal is the best contributor for energy, just like it is in the broiler feed. So this is an advantage that we find in US soybean meal that has continued to be prominent over the years. Part of the reasons, fiber is lower, the sucrose is also higher, and sucrose is the next exciting thing that we're looking at. And here I put together an analysis of the different energy fractions. If we look at the AMEN, which is the traditional ME for poultry, we can see that the US and the Brazilian meals are now somewhat similar. We've seen that the Brazilian soybean meals have increased in their energy content over the years. But when we come to the broiler AME, we can see that relative to the base, the US soybean meal is 104.8% of base, whereas the Brazilian soybean meal is only 102.5% of base. And the reason we can see there on the next line is that the sucrose level is close to 7% on average in the soybean meal, as opposed to 5.24 average in the Brazilian meal. And the sucrose is a good contributor to the energy status of the animal. If we look at the swine side, again, we have the same pattern. The Brazilian energy level is slightly lower than base, and the American soybean meal is higher than the base. And down below, just to remind ourselves, I put the 2 equations for the AME for poultry in general, which is the WAPSA from 1989. This does not include any differentiation for the starch and the sugars. The more up-to-date data includes a term in the calculation of the energy for the digestible starch and sugars. And this is where technically we're starting to see a wider appreciation of the value of the soybean meal in terms of its energy. Well, just looking down very quickly, Dr. Mateos has reviewed this data. US soybean meal has the highest lysine, methionine, cysteine, tryptophan as a percent of crude protein. And it's got in the totals the highest lysine, methionine, cysteine, tryptophan on an as-fed basis. So US meal, although I've said a lot about energy, is still a big contributor to the amino acids. When we look at the digestible amino acids, here we go, we find that the major amino acids, that's the lysine, methionine, cysteine, threonine, tryptophan, the American soybean meal is ahead of the game. And on the less well noticed amino acids, isoleucine, valine, arginine, the data is somewhat similar. If anything now, there is a slight edge for the Brazilian soybean meal. But when we look at the total nutrient profile, we get the ideal result. We can't look at these individual nutrients and pick out any one of them as being the determinant of value of the soybean meal. Neither can we rely on any one of these to be the determinant of the value of what we will pay for soybean meal in order to make money out of that purchase. Well, if we look at, I'll skip the digestible amino acids for swine. There we go. Let's see how we put this into the nutrient value calculator. We take this data as above, and this is basically the raw data that we put into a feed formulation system. We then put up the feed tonnages of the representative clients. And when I do these evaluations, I set up economic models of feed mills producing 10,000 tons of their particular brand of poultry or layer. And then we select the soybean meals that we're going to be testing. So in this test run, we're going to be looking at Argentine, Brazilian, US, and Indian sources for the economics. We then will optimize that range of diets in each country under their prices with their local ingredient values and with their diets. And we report the usage of ingredients, the total cost of goods for each of the scenarios that we're looking at. And then we analyze the cost of goods differentials to get the valuation of the soybean meal in practice to determine what we can buy in order to make a profitable trade and grow animals efficiently. So here is the first slide that shows the way we put our solution together. You can see that I've got 4 feeds in this series. This is the Malaysian grow out series. And I've given you an example here of one of the feed specs as it's been optimized inside the model. And just like a least cost system, we've got a minimum amount of corn, a maximum amount of corn, and all the ingredients. We have the price, and it's calculating an amount for us. On the next page, we've got the nutrient side of the least cost calculation. We've got the specification minimum and maximum nutrients and the calculated amounts. So that's the very similar to the inside of a formulation system. And then we look at the usage. Now, when I explain to potential clients who are looking at a soybean meal that is more expensive, they will often say, yes, I understand the quality is better, but please explain to me why it is that if I pay more for a soybean meal, my feed cost comes down. And this is a difficult concept to grasp until we look at the usage of ingredients of the different types we put into the least cost. Now, I've got the 4 different types of soybean meal here, and you can see that the Argentine, Brazilian, Indian, and US soybean meal demand is different for each scenario. And this is a key factor for us, because unless we understand the difference in the volumes, it's difficult for us to perceive where the value is coming from. So as I move from Argentine soybean meal to US soybean meal, notice that I use less. I use about 25 to 30 kilos less, or about 2.5% less US soybean meal compared to Argentine. And as I go from Argentine to US, I use less fat. So these usage reports can show us the dynamics of the substitutions that take place, and they can be across all of the ingredients. The corn will change, the fat will change. The supplemental amino acids will also change. And all of these things come together to give us a holistic value of our soybean meal. And then we come in to do the economic analysis. Now, as I mentioned, we are focusing very much on cost of goods. And if you look at that first column, you can see next to the Argentine soybean meal where it says base, I'm saying that this is the base level of cost of goods per month. And it's around about $45,000 about $2.5 million per month to supply this mill. As I move to the Brazilian soybean meal at the same price in this case, I'm actually saving money. I'm making more money because my cost of goods is dropping. So I have a $37,000 advantage on the table here that I can capture on the Americas. And if I look at the US soybean meal, there is a $46,000 almost differential in using US soybean meal. And this is extra money made by using a higher density ingredient that contributes more to all of the nutrients that matter to me in my feed. We then move on to the next one. And this is Ecuador. We'll go to Indonesia. And we can see the same sort of pattern that as I go from Argentine, I go up to the Brazilian meal. We've got an increase in the yield of about $31,000. If I use Indian soybean meal, I'm going to be losing money on that trade. And then if I use the US soybean meal, I'm going to be making further profits on the trade. And finally, we'll go to let's look at the Morocco spread. There we go, Morocco spread. I put the Brazilian meal into Morocco. I was making an additional $45,000 per ton. And if I put Indian into Morocco, it will be a $39,000 loss. If I put US soybean meal at the same price into Morocco in a 10,000 ton feed mill, I will yield an additional profit of $69,000. Well, it's this feed cost reduction that gets us excited when we're translating nutrient value into profitability. But let's see if we can understand how we can then evaluate the price we can pay for a particular soybean meal. And it's quite a simple calculation. Let's look at the US line at the bottom. We have got a total cost of goods difference of an advantage of $69,200 per month additional yield in the saving of the cost of goods. There's a usage there of soybean meal of 2,990 tons. And that means I've got a premium of $23 per ton here in Morocco. And that is simply the profit yielded divided by the total usage of soybean meal gives me that premium of $23 per ton. So what does that tell me I can do? That if I put all of these soybean meals in at the same price, in this case of $376 for a test, it means I can go up to $399 and still make money on that trade. So we have what we call a premium spread analysis here, that the nutritional parity price, $399, is the relative value of the soybean meal in this market. And of course, we emphasize that it's going to be different in different places around the world. So I've summarized the results here, make it clear, and we can see the Americas, Ecuador, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Morocco side by side. And if we look at that relative value line at the bottom, and we'll compare for brevity the Argentine to the US, with Argentine and America at $360 per ton, we have an equivalent value economically of $375.25 per ton. Ecuador is a much higher price market, $435 base for Argentine. We can go as high as $456.26 per ton for US soybean meal and still save money in our feeds, taking into account the full nutrient contributions of the energy, protein, amino acids, and even the minerals. Now, the table at the bottom, we've got the premiums, the spreads. So in Americas, the spread from Argentine to US, 15.25 US dollar per ton premium. Ecuador, that value goes up to 21.26. Indonesia, where although the corn price is high, The price of fat is still quite low. The spread is $14.57 per ton. Malaysia is rather in the middle there, 17.78, and Morocco has a high value yield because of the high fat price of $23.15. So as we look across this, we can see that the US in these different markets around the world, under different conditions of tariffs, transport, and availability of different ingredients, US soybean meal has still got a nice, healthy economic advantage on its full nutrient profile of between, and on this data, $14.57 per ton up to $23.15 per ton. So with that concluding remark on the value, I thank you very much for your kind attention, and I would welcome any questions. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Matthew, thank you very much for your presentation. As always, very insightful. That's a lot to absorb in a short period of time, but your presentation clearly makes the economical link many buyers need to consider when making a decision on purchasing. I do encourage the group, if you didn't get the right definition on the tables that were presented by Matthew, certainly go to our handout widget. You can download the presentation itself. So, I think that will give you an opportunity to ask more questions. We're getting flooded with questions, and that is great. We do have some questions that vary on the level of complexity. Some are simpler, some are very complex. So we'll start with a combination. With this in mind, I'd like to proceed with the Q&A session. I see, Matthew, you've joined us, and I'd like to confirm the audio with Dr. Mateos in Madrid. Dr. Mateos, can you hear us?
Yeah, perfectly.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Mateos.
Yeah.
So we'll start with a very simple question. First, this one will go to Mr. Clark. Matthew, this is I think you addressed this question, but let's get some more clarity. It's very simple. Why does the value of soy meal change in different regions?
Okay. If we go to different regions in the world, they will have different tariff structures for import in some cases. In some countries, they can produce fats and oils very, very cheaply. And other countries, it's going to be expensive. If we look at the locally available protein sources or the amino acid markets, again, tariff sensitive, these can skew the value. So we do find that the balance of the costs between different commodities changes from region to region. It's often because of trade or tariff reasons, actually. But we look as we emphasize the energy levels. We look at Southeast Asia as being a big producer of relatively low-cost oils. We don't see quite such a big advantage as we would in the Middle East, where oils are a more expensive commodity. They have to be imported as against locally produced. So that's the reason. It's different agricultural dynamics across the whole spectrum of feed ingredients.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go with the following question here, and this is for Dr. Mateos. Dr. Mateos, why does the soybean damage grading factor differ from origin to origin? Is this important for the evaluation of the nutritional value of soybeans or, in turn, soybean meal?
To me, this is a question that nobody ever looked at, and it's much more important than people believe. To me, right now, it's a key question. For example, I read the other day 2 different reports are not coming from the same source, but explaining that the US bean, they used to have less than 1-2% of damaged grains. However, in a different report the same week, the vessels coming from Brazil or exported from Brazil used to have from 4 to 5% damaged beans. And to me, that's important. You have damaged beans, garbage in, garbage out. And I don't know how bad it is, but I can tell you, damaged beans are not improving the quality of the soybean meal. In this aspect, one thing that everybody knows, but we don't follow the importance that it has, is, for example, the free fatty acid content of the oil of the soybeans. why the soybean from Brazil has more free fatty acid or more acidity? Because it in some way has been destroyed, not destroyed, has been affected. So the quality is worse, not because are from Brazil, it's because of the weather condition, the germination, the fermentation, the humidity, the raining that happens very often in the equator area. So my question is, nobody is looking how this affects the protein. And I don't know for sure. But one thing I have clear, if the oil is affected, which is very easy to look, just looking at the free fatty acids or the peroxides, if the damage is bigger, if the oil is affected, why the protein is not affected? So my feeling is also affected. How much? We don't know. But to me, this is very, very important. Every time morning, and in fact, right now I'm working on this area, how the weather condition, not at harvesting, because could be before harvesting. If, for example, in the US or Canada, you decided to harvest the soybeans on Tuesday, you will do it. But in some areas of the Ecuador area or the humid area, you cannot, because it rains and rains and rains. And for example, this is important because if you have fermentation that, for example, in 2016 that happened in Argentina and 2 years ago again, if there is fermentation, you reduce the sucrose and the oligosaccharides that will be fermented, but nobody is looking at that. But if you reduce the sucrose and the oligosaccharides, you are increasing what people believe is protein. No, you are increasing the nitrogen because you have more because you are taking out. So here in Europe, for example, in 2017, the crop of the 2016, the people were very happy because the protein was higher, was around 46, when usually is slightly below. No, people were very happy. There's no reason to be happy. They were not protein; it was nitrogen.
Very good. Very good. Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Mateos. I have a follow-up question here for Dr. Mateos, and I'm taking them as I receive them. This is regarding or referring to your study, I believe, or to the study that you participated in. Were the sucrose differences statistically different?
Yeah, I have conducted 3 big studies that the 3 of them has been published. One of them published in 2016, in which I analyzed 515 samples from the country of origin, comparing Argentina, Brazil, and the USA, but the soybeans and the soybean meal were from the same country. So they were not crushed in other countries. The second was I asked people in Europe, the main companies in Europe, to give me 10 samples. Selected by them, I analyze and send them back the results. And then I pick up during 4 years all the data together. And I present that in the Arkansas Nutrition Conference a couple of years ago. And this last one, remember, is a meta-analysis. These are not Gonzalo Mateos data. I just analyzed. The data are from 18 different professors, scientists all over the world. The only thing I did is to put together doing the correct analysis. But these are not my data. This is my conclusions, but not the data. In the three of them, very clearly, sucrose was totally significant difference. Not only sucrose, everything, even phosphorus, that the difference is 0.02, it was significant difference because we have 2,000 samples. When you have a lot of samples, you find huge difference in everything, and some of them are not important because but they are different, which is, to me, is important. What I said always, I don't care, and I express that, no, I don't care. Everybody cares about everything. But the key issue that I said, if the p-values for sucrose, the p-values for protein, for lysine profile, for phosphorus, if everything is different, means that the soybeans are not the same. And to me, the main point is not, in this case, for example, here we are telling that it's better, but to me, the key point for everybody is that the soybean meals are different. If you send me a sample, I will tell you from which country it's coming. If I do that, and you are putting together in the same bin, soybean meal from Argentina, Brazil, and the USA with the same values, probably you are doing wrong. That you are doing wrong doesn't mean that you can do other things, because if you have only one bin, there's nothing you can do. But you have to know that it's not the best solution for getting all the beans from the different countries in the same bin.
Thank you, Gonzalo. And this question is, we'll go to Matthew now. This question is interesting, and I think both of you can answer, but let's start with Matthew. And it says, Matthew, I can understand how using your calculator can show a better value for different soybean meals based upon the data on past research. How do we know this information is still valid or current today, or how do we keep it current? Matthew, if you can hear me, that is one of the questions.
Yes, sorry, my video has just dropped up.
No problem.
Can you hear me?
That is a good picture, by the way, huh?
Okay. How do we know it's valid? Well, we keep looking continuously at the data stream on the soybean meal that comes in. There are some important things to remember here. When we want to check the validity of the soybean meal data, we need to look at it in season rather than trying to guess what's coming in on the next boat. So we need to keep our data up to date, but we also need to have an idea of the cyclic nature of the values of soybean meal coming in. So I will be projecting trends based on the last 3 or 4 years experience of US soybean meal being delivered to me at different times of the year. Same with Argentine, same with Brazilian soybean meal. Provided we keep the data technically up to date, our economic conclusions are also going to be continually valid.
Now, if I can add a small comment on that, this is very clear. Every year, the soybeans vary year after year. For example, in the second work that we did, we pick up samples from the main institutions in Europe, the main companies, for 4 consecutive years. And of course, the values change for the US meal, for the USA, for the Brazilian, for the Argentina. They change. We know that. Now, my point is, if you receive a vessel always from the same company and you receive it and you have it for 3 months, it's a good idea to use this data in your evaluation of the soybean meal and the matrix. Now, somebody asked me, what is going to be next year matrix for the soybean meal? I don't have any idea. I do not have any idea the next year will be good or bad, because it will depend on the north and the south. It will depend on so many things. So in case that you are not sure, the best thing you can do is the average of the last 20 years. Not the last year, not the next year, not what the neighbors told you. So be careful. The average data is a very sound number. And of course, if you have a vessel, that data is much better, for sure.
Yeah. Thank you, Gonzalo. And my follow-up question to you, Gonzalo, was going to be, I know in your presentation you outlined the importance on quality and in relationship to the growing region's proximity to the equator, right? And I would imagine that has a sustainable impact. I mean, you cannot change the growing regions, from one day to the other, obviously. And I would imagine that has shown and will continue to show maintaining that difference because the growing regions are actually stable. Let's put it that way. So the quality will remain somewhat constant given that. Would you agree with that, Gonzalo?
Yeah, no, it's totally, because remember, when you try to tell something and you have to simplify, it's very dangerous. Every time that you simplify, you start telling nonsenses. So you have to be careful. What I know that the Ecuador has a lot of interest and importance to see the big numbers. For example, if I see, for example, South Africa production of soybeans is close to the north, and the north of South Africa is close to the south of Brazil or the north of Argentina. So I know more or less that the crude protein of these soybeans will be between Argentina and Brazil. And that's happened. And the same for sucrose. And the same. But there are many other things that might influence. For example, altitude. I never check on the altitude of the soybeans. I just talk about the Ecuador. And the other day somebody asked me, how about the altitude? They say, I have no idea. I never thought on that, and I should. Because the altitude, of course, will influence, for example, in the sucrose, because sucrose is there in the plant just for drying, for dryness, for other things. So remember, Ecuador doesn't mean latitude, means day length, for example, means raining, means that the harvesting is not the day that you plant. If the soybeans are mature and it's raining and you cannot harvest, they will germinate, and you have germination will change the composition. That's what I mean. But the latitude will give you a general idea. But there are many, many things. Of course, for example, crushing is much more important than than latitude. But for example, in Europe, when we receive a vessel from Brazil, we don't know from which crushing plant it's coming. Probably it's coming from 20 different crushing plants. So I don't care. I mean, I care, but there's nothing I can do. So things that I cannot solve, I'm not interested on that. I can solve the country of origin, but I cannot tell and I cannot work on the differences in crushing plants.
Excellent. Thank you, Gonzalo. Matthew, I have a question here for you. Says, what is the trend in the values of the spreads between soybean meal from the major producing countries? We've been talking about it. You've addressed it, but I think it's a good recap question. So I'll leave it up to you.
Oh, okay. As we look at the difference between 2016 and 2020, the spread between the U.S. meals and the spread between the U.S. meals and the Argentine meals has widened slightly. So there's about another $1 spread available on the table. It looks as though on the surface that the Brazilian meals are improving. They're catching up a little bit with the U.S. soybean meals. I would be cautious there if we expand our understanding of soybean meal from Brazilian beans to include locally produced soybean meal of Brazilian bean origin, because the damage to the beans we see coming out of Brazil does have to come into the equation. We're seeing higher levels of damaged beans going into the processing plants overseas, producing a local soybean meal with Brazilian origin or US origin. And I think there we're not seeing that contrast that has been emerging in the 2020 data. Brazil, in terms of the bean quality, is still very challenged. When I see damaged beans, I immediately think of two things. One is the lower oil yield of distilled oil. I look also at the protein quality being compromised and downstream performance of the soybean meal also being changed. So long-term trend, it appears that from the data that the Brazil is closing the gap a little bit, but I'm not convinced that when we're getting enough data yet, and I'm really excited to see this coming through, on the damage of the protein and how that affects the digestibility and the bean performance in the field. That one I don't think is closed quite as much as the data shows.
Yeah, that's for sure. And to share with our audience too, we are working at USSEC in collecting data, buying data actually to have a global meal quality analysis, on a almost live basis to be able to share this information with our customers and help them make a more informed decision. So, and clearly, Genesis Feed Technology is working with us in that process. We hope to have that soon and be able to share some of that information with customers. Gonzalo, I have changing subjects a bit, and I have a question for you. Just came through. Why? And I think it's talking about the meta-analysis. Why is the reactive lysine parameter not mentioned in the meta-analysis?
Yeah. First, in the one that I conducted in the past, the two that I mentioned, the one published in Animal Feed Science Technology in 2016, and the one in the Arkansas Nutrition Conference, I did. But the one that I did there was the hitch damage indicator, which was the value that in that moment Ebony was recommending to look mostly to the Maillard reaction or reactive lysine, not only, but mostly to that. So in these papers, these data are shown. And very clearly, in this case, the US meal has much better reactive lysine levels than the Argentina and Brazilian. In these papers is published, and in fact, Ebony did the analysis for me, so it was not in my lab. It was just conducted in Hanau in Germany. Now, why in the meta-analysis is not included? Because nobody included that. I pick up, remember, 18 samples. There is some condition in the paper that is already published, and you can find it. It's free of charge. You will see that none of the other companies or the other groups, scientists, look for the reactive lysine. So I couldn't do a meta-analysis of data that were not existing. I only have this data from my own research, but not for the others. So there's no way to do it. I hope I can do it next time, but not this.
Very good. Very good. I have another question here, Mr. Matthew Clark. Could you use your program to analyze full-fat soya?
Oh, Yes, indeed we can, and we've done some studies on the value of soybeans going through different processes. We've done some studies on moisture loss during processing of full-fat soybean. Very interesting results. We think that there is still a very good scope for buying beans, shipping them overseas, doing good QC on those beans, locally processing them, to give a balance of risk management on protein sourcing in overseas markets. So yes, I would encourage anyone looking at investing in a full-fat soya process to check out the nutritional values of the materials they're going to be producing. I'd encourage people also to look at the moisture control. Most of these full-fat soya processes lose moisture, but as provided we account for it in the nutritional side, as we lose the moisture, we gain nutrients, generally speaking. We can find that there is a significant value from full-fat soya that can be evaluated. And yes, we do that.
Perfect. Thank you very much. We are, we're getting so many questions, and I have to apologize. We won't be able to address them all. And we're getting close to the hour here, and some of us have commitments at the hour. Mr. Clark, I'm going to give you the floor for 1 minute to share your last comments on this event and give us your last thoughts, and then we'll proceed to Gonzalo. Mr. Clark.
Okay. Well, firstly, thank you very much for the opportunity to join in this discussion. It's a very exciting area. We are finding from this next round of data that there's still a very favorable economic advantage to U.S. soybean meals in the markets we've studied so far around the world. It's hovering around the sort of $15 to $20 market size. There is still work to be done on the quality of the beans and how they can be processed overseas, and we can see that the industry is still well ahead, and that's very much the credit of the American farmers and the work they do to maintain the quality of these beans. So, as an overseas buyer, thank you very much, gentlemen, ladies.
Thank you, and thank you for participating. Now, Dr. Mateos, again, we have another minute and a half, and I'd like to give the floor to you so you can share your last comments, thoughts on the meta-analysis and on the event. Go ahead, Gonzalo.
To me, as a general idea, remember, as Dr. Salinas mentioned before, I worked for the industry for many years with a big co-op. I worked there for 10 years as the general manager of the feed mills and the production, and I never thought that the soybean meal could be different. So don't make that mistake. And don't pay attention. I don't need you to pay attention to my meta-analysis or to my own data. Doesn't matter. You have to pay attention to your own data, your own feeling, and the information that you gather. But do it. Remember, for 20 years, I never looked at the quality of the soybean meal, and now I'm telling you that they are different. So I missed 30 years of information. So be careful with that and check on that in your facilities.
Thank you, Gonzalo. By no means am I a doctor. I think my master's degree is all I got. So don't, you're overranking me. So, but thank you for sharing that. And I just would like to say that, I come from the commercial side, and values are different. The values of each component is different. The decision is not a one size fits all. There's different alternatives for every buyer, and prices are constantly changing. So the best that we can do is to understand the concepts, and then we can use our prices and alternatives to make the best formulation for our customers. With that in mind, I like to take the opportunity to thank the USSEC team once again for helping us put this together. I would like to thank our audience for hanging with us, and I am deeply sorry we could not get to all your questions, and I have more questions that I can handle. With that in mind, I'd like to wish everybody in the U.S. a happy 4th of July weekend. And our audience around the world, many thanks for participating, and hopefully we can continue these sessions in the future. Once again, thank you very much, and we'll see you soon.